Harrison Ford, you reveal in your book, after 40 years, is that right?
40 years I thought I'd wait.
Okay, so you reveal that you were having an affair with Harrison Ford.
I was.
Well, you say it.
For more than half a century, Harrison Ford has been one of the most recognized faces on the planet. The man who flew the Millennium Falcon, cracked the whip as Indiana Jones, and hunted replicants through rain-soaked streets built a career so dominant that it reshaped what Hollywood stardom even meant. But here is the thing about Harrison Ford that has always made him different from almost every other actor of his generation. The bigger his name got, the quieter he became. While other stars turned their personal lives into press releases, Ford pulled in the opposite direction. He gave fewer interviews, revealed less, and protected the boundaries between his public image and his private world with something close to obsession. So when a man like that, now 83 years old, begins to open up about his marriages, his regrets, and the personal cost of living at the center of a cultural storm for 5 decades, it is worth paying very close attention. Because what he has shared reveals something far more complicated and far more human than the legend ever suggested. To understand what Ford has finally begun to acknowledge about his personal life, you have to go back to the version of him that existed before any of it happened. Before the franchises, before the global recognition, before the magazine covers and the billion-dollar box office numbers, there was a young man in Los Angeles in the early 1960s who was not particularly succeeding at anything. Ford had arrived at acting not through a burning childhood dream or drama school scholarship, but through a kind of practical restlessness. He took small roles when he could find them, picked up carpentry work when he could not, and moved between the two worlds without much certainty that either one would ever amount to anything lasting. His early television appearances were forgettable. His contract with Columbia Pictures ended without producing anything memorable. By his own later admission, there were long stretches during this period when acting felt more like a habit than a career. It was during this uncertain, unglamorous phase of his life that he met and married Mary Marquardt in 1964. This is a detail that matters more than it might initially seem, because their relationship was formed entirely outside of fame. There was no Hollywood courtship, no industry visibility, no external pressure from public life shaping what they were to each other. They were simply two people building something together in ordinary circumstances, and the foundation of that marriage was laid when Ford was, by any reasonable measure, just a working man trying to find his footing. Their sons, Benjamin and Willard, were born in 1966 and 1969 respectively, and the household they built together in Los Angeles reflected the reality of a family supported partly by film work and partly by the income Ford earned from carpentry jobs, including renovation work he performed for various figures connected to the entertainment industry. It was modest, grounded, and largely invisible to the outside world. Then everything changed in ways that nobody, including Ford himself, was fully prepared for. The path that led to that change began when his carpentry work brought him into contact with director George Lucas, a connection that eventually led to a small role in American Graffiti and, more significantly, positioned him within Lucas's orbit when casting began for a new science fiction project that most people inside the industry regarded with skepticism. Star Wars, in 1976, was not an obvious bet. The production was chaotic, the budget was under constant pressure, the script was still evolving during filming, and even the studio financing it was uncertain about what kind of film it was making. Ford was not originally there to audition for the role of Han Solo. He was reading lines opposite other actors during casting sessions, helping Lucas evaluate dialogue, when something began to shift. The character took on a different texture through Ford's particular delivery, drier, more skeptical, more grounded than the material might have otherwise suggested. Lucas noticed. The role was his. What happened after Star Wars premiered in May 1977 is one of the most dramatic transformations in the history of popular entertainment. The film opened in a limited number of theaters and expanded almost immediately due to audience demand that the studio had not anticipated and could not have planned for. Lines formed around city blocks. The cultural conversation shifted almost overnight. And Harrison Ford, who had driven to auditions in a pickup truck and built kitchen cabinets between acting jobs, suddenly found himself at the center of something enormous and completely unprecedented in his own experience. The transition from anonymous working actor to internationally recognized star happened in a matter of months. There was no gradual adjustment period. There was before, and then there was after, and the two felt almost entirely disconnected from each other. Ford has reflected in various interviews over the years that this kind of sudden, total exposure is genuinely disorienting in ways that are difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it. Privacy, which he had never particularly thought about because it had never been at risk, suddenly became something he had to actively defend. Ordinary routines became complicated. The texture of daily life changed. And critically, the marriage to Mary Marquardt, which had been built on the foundation of a quiet and ordinary shared existence, was now being asked to adapt to conditions that were almost the opposite of everything it had been formed in. Ford has been careful over the years not to reduce the end of that marriage to a single cause or a single event. The picture, as he has acknowledged, was more complicated than that. During the production of Star Wars in England and Tunisia, something happened that would not become public knowledge for nearly 4 decades. A brief personal relationship formed between Ford, then 33 and married, and Carrie Fisher, then 19 and newly cast as Princess Leia. The production environment they shared was intensely pressurized. Long hours, an unfamiliar country, a script that kept changing, and the particular kind of emotional closeness that forms between people in high-stress creative environments far from home. Fisher would not speak publicly about this period in any detail for a very long time. When she finally did, in her 2016 memoir, she framed it not as scandal but as personal archaeology, an attempt to understand who she had been at 19 and what she had felt during one of the most formative periods of her life. She described the journals she had kept during filming and used them to reconstruct her emotional experience with honesty and a kind of rueful tenderness. Ford's response to the publication of Fisher's memoir was characteristically minimal. He did not deny the substance of what she had written. He did not elaborate on it either. In interviews conducted after the book came out, he described the situation simply as feeling strange, declined to say whether he had read the memoir, and consistently redirected conversations away from the subject. After Fisher's death in December 2016, he stopped discussing it altogether, issuing only a brief statement that focused on her talent, her courage, and her personality rather than on any shared history between them. Those who know Ford well have described this pattern as entirely consistent with who he is, a man who processes things internally, who resists the public performance of private emotion, and who draws a firm line between what the world gets to see and what actually belongs to him. What Ford has been more willing to address, particularly in more recent years as the perspective of age has shifted what feels important to say, is the broader cost of the life he chose and the life that chose him. Fame at the scale he experienced it in the late 1970s and through the 1980s is not something that leaves a marriage untouched, regardless of what else is happening inside that marriage. The professional demands that followed Star Wars were immediate and relentless. Indiana Jones arrived in 1981 with Raiders of the Lost Ark, a film that confirmed what Star Wars had suggested, that Ford was not a one-franchise phenomenon but a genuine and durable movie star capable of anchoring entirely different kinds of stories. The film became the highest-grossing release of 1981 in the United States and earned 9 Academy Award nominations. It also launched a franchise that would continue to define his public identity for more than 4 decades. His marriage to Mary Marquardt ended in 1979. Ford has never presented the dissolution of that marriage as something simple or easily explained. What he has acknowledged, in the fragmented and careful way that he tends to acknowledge personal things, is that the man who came out the other side of the Star Wars phenomenon was not the same man who had gone in, and that the gap between who he had become and the life he had built before fame arrived was real and significant. The marriage had been formed in one set of conditions and was being asked to survive in conditions that were almost entirely opposite. That is not an excuse. It is an observation about the particular kind of pressure that rapid, total transformation places on the structures that existed before it. In 1983, Ford married screenwriter Melissa Matheson, whose credits included the screenplay for E.T. the Extraterrestrial, one of the defining films of that entire decade. Their marriage lasted 17 years and produced 2 children, Malcolm, born in 1987, and Georgia, born in 1990. This was a longer and in many ways more stable chapter of his personal life, shaped by 2 people who understood the entertainment industry from the inside and who had both achieved significant things within it. But the professional demands of Ford's career during the 1980s and 1990s were not modest. Production schedules pulled him across multiple continents. Filming for the Indiana Jones sequels, for Blade Runner, for The Fugitive, and for a long series of other major projects created sustained periods of geographic separation that accumulated over years into something more structural. The couple separated in 2000 and their divorce was finalized in 2004. Matheson passed away in 2015, and Ford, though he did not speak publicly at length about that loss, acknowledged it in ways consistent with someone processing genuine grief quietly. The 3rd chapter of his personal life, and by all accounts the most settled, began in 2002 when he met actress Callista Flockhart at the Golden Globe Awards. Flockhart was then at the height of her own public recognition through Ally McBeal, a cultural phenomenon in its own right. What developed between them over the following years was notably different in pace and texture from the earlier relationships in Ford's life. It was not formed in the heat of a film production. It was not shaped by the particular kind of compressed intensity that comes from working together under pressure in an unfamiliar environment. It was something that developed more slowly, during a phase of Ford's life when he was no longer in the process of becoming something but had long since arrived at whatever he was going to be. They married in 2010 in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Ford later adopted Flockhart's son Liam, a decision that reflected something significant about where he was in his understanding of what family meant to him. Ford has described his relationship with Flockhart in terms that reflect a hard-won understanding of what actually sustains two people over time. The things he values in that relationship, the stability, the privacy, the absence of performance, are almost exactly the opposite of the qualities that define the most chaotic periods of his earlier personal life. He has talked about the importance of not confusing fame with meaning, and about the particular difficulty of maintaining any genuine sense of self when the entire world has decided who you are and keeps insisting on it. At 83, with a kind of perspective that only comes from actually living through the full arc of something rather than just anticipating it, he has been more willing than at any previous point in his life to acknowledge what the choices he made cost him and what he wishes he had understood earlier. What emerges from everything Ford has said and chosen not to say over the course of a very long career is a portrait of someone who spent decades trying to protect the interior of his life from the consuming pressure of his public identity, and who succeeded at that project more than most people in his position ever managed to. The marriages that ended did not end loudly or dramatically. The relationships that defined him were not performed for public consumption. Even the things he has finally begun to acknowledge at this stage of his life are delivered with a characteristic restraint that refuses to turn personal history into entertainment. He is not giving the world a confessional. He is simply allowing, slowly and on his own terms, a little more light into rooms that he has kept private for a very long time. At 83, Harrison Ford remains, in many ways, exactly who he has always been. A man who built something extraordinary in public while keeping the most important parts of himself stubbornly, deliberately, and perhaps wisely out of view.